Dust rained on Sergeant Robert Bondurant's head with each artillery blast as he and his fellow radiomen abandoned their equipment for rifles. The German barrage had transformed their HQ at Hotel de la Poste into a lethal trap. Yet his orders were clear: stay at your post, hold the town at all costs. Through his headphones, Bondurant heard the Allied line crumbling. In the north, crypts exploded in the cemetery as GIs took cover among the fallen. To the east, German panzers had smashed through the last American roadblock. The haunting shriek of Screaming Meemies drew closer. Sweat-drenched, Bondurant clung to his switchboard. He was now the town's last remaining communications link. The entire Allied Normandy Breakout attempt was on the line. Then came the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. The radiomen raised their weapons with trembling hands as fanatical SS soldiers burst in with cries of "Heil Hitler!" On July 20th, 1944, a hidden bomb exploded right at Hitler's feet at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. A group of German military officers and civilians had just attempted to end the Führer's life and the Nazi regime in one fell swoop. But luck was not on their side. Hitler survived with minor injuries, and he was more furious than ever before. The plot on his life had failed, but the effect of the attack on the fate of the war had just begun. Just 5 days later, the Allies, who had recently landed on the beaches of Normandy, began Operation Cobra, a massive scheme to break out into mainland France and begin the unraveling of the Nazi regime. Hitler faced a dire situation. He was still recovering from his injuries, his mental health had deteriorated since the assassination attempt, and the Red Army was advancing into Poland and the Balkans. German allies and puppet states were trying to negotiate peace, and US troops had just broken out of their Normandy beachheads. If he couldn't stop their advance, Germany would be surrounded, and it would be over. He needed to prove once again why the Wehrmacht had conquered most of Europe. Desperate and deranged, Hitler ordered the only tactic he knew how to implement: a massive blitzkrieg counterattack to push the Allies back into the beaches. There was just one little problem: Hitler had just gutted his military brass. After the attempt on his life, fueled by a fierce paranoia, over 5,000 German officers, some as high-ranking as field marshals, were arrested or executed either for having participated in the plan or for being considered to be critical of Hitler's regime. The Führer was left with few options, and he appointed Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge to lead the operations, even when he was among those suspected of having known about the July 20th plot. The idea was simple: use General Patton's recent advance against himself by cutting off American supply lines behind him and leaving his force vulnerable. Hitler commanded the 7th Army, led by SS Lieutenant General Paul Hauser, to throw 4 panzer divisions, 2 of them elite SS divisions, and an SS Panzer Grenadier division at the weak center of the American line. The goal was to push to Avranches, where Normandy met Brittany, capture all the roads and strangle the American supply lines, making Patton starve if he did not retreat back to the beachheads. The exact point where Hitler planned to make an incision was in the town of Moran. The operation was named Lüttich, after the German name for Liège, which German forces had captured 30 years earlier. If executed properly, this plan would show not only the Allies, but all the dissidents in Berlin and every nation in the world that Hitler was not to be underestimated. Things, however, began to go south for Hitler as soon as the operation began. The American forces were not entirely unaware of German intentions. Although the Germans had initially maintained radio silence, the 2nd Panzer Division eventually broke it on August 6th, requesting Luftwaffe support. This gave the Allies a hint of what was coming, and soon the warning was relayed to General Omar Bradley, who commanded the US 12th Army Group. By August 7th, Bradley and his commanders had a complete picture of the German counterattack, and they moved to mount a defense. But time was running out, and when the Allies learned the details of Operation Lüttich, the attack was already on its way on the fringes of the American lines. Commander of the US First Army Courtney Hodges understood the centerpiece of the region, and thus the main target of the German attack would be the town of Moran and the overlooking hill 314. The tiny crossroads town had roads leading in all directions. If the Germans captured it, they would disrupt American supply lines and open a path to the coast, potentially splitting the Allied forces in Normandy. By now, the Allies were certain their eventual push toward Germany was inevitable, but if Hitler succeeded in cutting Patton off, he threatened to delay Allied operations in France by months. The task of protecting the town fell to the 30th Infantry Division, known as the Old Hickory. The unit had recently replaced the 1st Infantry Division in the area, and now these men, mostly National Guardsmen from North Carolina, South Dakota, and Tennessee, would have to withstand the full might of one of Hitler's last-ditched yet fierce attacks. The man in charge of defending the town and its surroundings was Colonel Hammond Burks. Burks knew that if he lost Hill 314, the town would fall, so as he briefed his men, he left that very clear. Hill 314 is the key to the whole area. In case of emergency, this hill has to be held at all costs. Burks also visited the local military HQ, located at the Hôtel de la Poste in Moran. The communications operating from this base were critical to the success of the defense efforts and therefore for the Allies' entire breakout attempt. The commander told lead communications man, Sergeant Robert Bondurant, that he had to keep the communications up no matter what. Stay at your post. Hold the town at all costs. Two Frenchmen approached an American roadblock on the outskirts of Moran. The men seemed a bit jittery and suspicious to the American soldiers, and they were questioned. They claimed to be leading a lost vehicle back to American lines. As they talked, a German machine gun crew, working with the Frenchmen, snuck past the roadblock and set themselves up behind a nearby fence. In a brutal surprise attack, the German machine gun tore through the American roadblock. Minutes later, dozens of German panzers overran the position. The assault of Moran had begun. German tank battalions charged ahead without the preceding customary artillery barrage in order to take the Americans by surprise. The Germans also understood that whoever controlled Hill 314 controlled the town, so the bulk of their forces moved to capture the high ground. The weather seemed to have allied itself with the Germans as a heavy, eerie fog covered the town, making Allied airstrikes ineffective. Kampfgruppe Fick, a battle group from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, led the charge, their soldiers yelling "Heil Hitler" as they climbed up the hill. The 30th Infantry Division's 120th Regiment defending the hill braced for the attack. G Company, led by Captain Reynold Eriksson, responded with a determined defense, unleashing heavy rifle and machine gun fire that stalled the German advance. Despite the almost religious ferocity of the SS, the defenders managed to keep Hill 314 in American hands during the initial hours of the onslaught. Lieutenant Robert Weiss, one of the forward artillery observers stationed on Hill 314, played a crucial role in keeping the Germans at bay. From his high ground position, Weiss directed artillery fire to rain hell over the approaching Germans, while also calling in strikes on German tanks and infantry. The artillery shells rained down on the attacking forces, breaking up their formations and forcing them to pull back. Meanwhile, in the town of Moran itself, Sergeant Robert Bondurant and his fellow radiomen were facing a dire situation. They were forced to trade their instruments for rifles as it became clear that the battle would reach their HQ location any moment now. After the initial surprise attack, German artillery began to rain down all across Moran, especially in the vicinity of Hôtel de la Poste. Bondurant, who had been personally tasked with keeping the communications up no matter the circumstances, clung to his switchboard as the old hotel trembled erratically with each thundering thud of an artillery round hitting the ground. Soon, the barrage actually hit the hotel, tearing the building apart piece by piece. Bondurant and the other communications officers continued to guard their station and keep communications running. After the artillery assaults, SS soldiers stormed Hotel de la Poste, breaching through the door and screaming, "Heil Hitler!" As the radiomen attempted to defend the communications room, Bondurant stayed at his switchboard until the very last minute, when the SS finally captured him. Bondurant was sure he was about to meet his maker. "I thought they were going to shoot us. Instead, they walked us back to an aid station. Wounded were lying around everywhere, both German and American." However, for the Americans on Hill 314, the nightmare was far from over. That evening, the fog finally began to lift. This was the moment the defenders had been waiting for. Lieutenant Robert Weiss, stationed on Hill 314, used the opportunity to call in artillery strikes on the exposed German columns. The shells burst on top of the advancing panzers and infantry, forcing them to turn back. The clear weather also allowed the Allies to bring their air power into action. General Omar Bradley requested support from US 9th Air Force and the RAF. Soon, Typhoon fighter bombers swooped in, unleashing 60-pound rockets and strafing the German tanks and vehicles with 20mm cannon fire. Wing Commander Charles Green, who took part in the strikes, was visibly excited about catching the Germans exposed. He told his men, "This is the moment we have all been waiting for, gentlemen, the chance of getting at Panzer tanks out in the open, and there are lots of the bastards." The relentless air strikes wreaked havoc on the German advance, forcing many of their armored vehicles to halt or scatter. The attacks from the air turned the tide of the battle. The German forces, initially advancing with confidence, were abruptly caught in a crossfire from both artillery and airstrikes. Sergeant Wendell Westall, positioned on Hill 314, watched as Typhoon fighters flew so close that he remarked, "Sure as hell, that one damned nearly parted my hair." In desperation and disarray, the SS troops launched several additional assaults against Hill 314, attempting to dislodge the American defenders. But they had lost the element of surprise, the cover of the fog, and the strategic edge. Additionally, the constant pummeling of artillery and airstrikes crippled their initiative. Private Joe Shipley, who had never fired a bazooka before, knocked out a German tank when it tried to make it to the top of the hill during one of the Germans' most audacious attempts. By August 12th, Allied reinforcements finally arrived to relieve the exhausted defenders on Hill 314. The 35th Infantry Division cleaved its way through the remaining German siege forces to reach the defenders. Of the original 700 men on Hill 314, only 357 walked out. Though battered, the defenders had held the hill and blunted the German offensive, ensuring the Allies maintained control of the critical road network. Hitler's only attempt to counter the breakout from Normandy had failed miserably, and now nothing was stopping the Allies from reaching the borders of Germany.